This is the Kamlan 28mm f1.4 lens for APS-C and Micro Four Thirds cameras, and it can be yours for under £200. Last year I reviewed the Kamlan 50mm f1.1 lens, and now Kamlan are back with this new 28mm f1.4 lens. Now it's been on Kickstarter for a while and it's just about to go into full production, but they have sent me a full production version to review so I can tell you guys a little bit more about the lens and just what it's all about. Now first up, this lens is designed for cameras with an APS-C or Micro Four Thirds sensors. It comes in Canon EOS M, Micro Four Thirds, Fuji X and Sony E mounts, and it's obviously the Sony E mount version that I'm reviewing here with the A6500. Now the lens has a 28mm focal length, but with an image circle that only covers an APS-C sensor. Now that means compared to a full frame camera, it's the equivalent of a 42mm lens when you're using it on an APS-C camera, or 56mm when you're using it on Micro Four Thirds. Now I'm sure the first question that many of you, particularly Sony users, are going to want to know is, what does this lens look like on a full frame sensor? Well, as you would sadly expect, it shows significant vignetting. It's a little bit less at the minimum focus distance, but if you have got a full frame camera, then of course you can use it at a reduced resolution by putting your sort of Sony A7 camera into its APS-C crop sensor mode. So let's talk build quality. Now it's very similar to the 50mm f1.1 lens. It's a metal construction, has a bit of weight behind it. Now the construction seems pretty good in the month or so that I've been using at it. It's nicely put together with no creaks or wobbles, but it's obviously, you know, too early to talk about long-term quality, but my instincts say that this lens is going to be fine. It comes with a plastic lens hood, although on Kickstarter I note that they're saying that they were supplying with a metal lens hood, so not quite sure what that's about. Now as you can see on the back here, there is absolutely no electronic connections here with the camera. The lens is manual focus only. There's no communication between the camera and the lens, so no focal length or aperture or focus distance values are going to be exchanged with your camera. Now the manual focus ring at the front here has just about the right amount of torque, I reckon, for me anyway. It's not so loose that it slips or you might overshoot, but it's not so rigid that it's difficult to turn. It's just, if you ask me, it's just perfect. I really actually like it. They've done well and it turns really nicely with a nice fluid motion there. Now the aperture ring here is actually clickless with markers denoting where the aperture settings are. Now here the aperture ring is a bit firmer, a lot firmer in fact than the focus ring, but you kind of want that because you don't want it to sort of knock out of place or to slip. Now it's interesting to note here that the values on the aperture ring are f1.4, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, and then we miss f11 and jump straight to f16. Just worth noting that you have to kind of put it somewhere between f8 and f16 if you want to shoot at f11. Now filter thread wise, the lens accepts 52mm filters, and reassuringly we've got a metal filter thread ring there. That's really good. We've also got quite an impressive 11 aperture blades in here, so we should expect to see some nice circular bokeh all the way from 1.4 all the way to f16. Okay, so let's get on to talking about image quality. First, vignetting. There is a little vignetting when you're using it wide open at f1.4. You'd kind of expect that, but it's not very hard and it eases out slowly at the edges. Now, as most of you know by now, I like a little bit of vignetting just to draw attention to the center of the frame. If you don't like vignetting, then it's barely discernible by the time you get to kind of 2.8. And of course, it's really easy to remove if you're using your editing software. Now let's look at a really boring brick wall photo so we can get an idea of curvilinear distortion. Now, as you can see, there's quite minimal barrel distortion, with the corners just showing a slight curve in the pointing on the brickwork. Now, obviously a brick wall isn't completely scientific, but it does give you an idea of what the distortion is going to be like. There's nothing really to worry about here. If you're photographing architectural buildings, then a quick adjustment should rectify it straight away. But for landscapes or portraits, you know, I probably wouldn't even bother correcting it, to be perfectly honest. Now, I've also made a very temporary kind of resolution sharpness test chart. We're working on something a little bit more permanent. Now, this chart is just a series of resolution stars in the corner and at the center. I put them on a sheet of A2 card and placed it on a flat surface, and it's lit by daylight on a bright but hazy day. Not the most scientific of tests again, but it should be good enough to tell us how this lens performs. Now, center sharpness performs exactly as you would expect. It sharpens up as you move through the aperture range, and it reaches its sharpness around probably f5.6 to f8, somewhere in between. Now, with no f11 marking on the lens, I jumped up to f16, where diffraction just softens the images a touch, but it's not too bad, I have to say. Now, f5.6 and f8, the lens is at its sharpest, and it's probably sharper than a lens for this price, you know, than is justified. It's certainly sharper than I was expecting it to be. Now, to check the corner sharpness, I took a new series of shots, and this time I focused actually in the corner. This way, the difference in the sort of curvature field and depth of field from the center to the edge isn't going to be taken into account. So we'll see just how the lens performs if you're focusing on a subject at the very edges of the frame. Now, at f1.4, the very edges of images are pretty bad, but you don't need to come in too much from the edge to see it start to sharpen up quite significantly. I think that the imaging circle of the lens could do with just being a fraction larger, just to get rid of that nastiness in the very corners. Now, by f8, images have sharpened up quite significantly, and f8 again is kind of the sharpest aperture. Now, obviously they're not as sharp as it's going to be in the center, but it's certainly usable at f8. Now, away from the clinical analysis of a test chart, the images do look a lot better, I have to say. The lack of any critical sharpness in the corners is kind of much less of an issue, and the subject is going to be, you know, much nearer the center of the frame, unless you're shooting kind of landscapes. But again, you can just crop out a little bit from there. Now, shooting at f1.4, images are really nice. They're sharp in the center, and the only thing you have to watch out for is chromatic aberrations. Stop down to f8 and the image again looks good almost across the entire frame. So regarding chromatic aberrations, there is some green magenta fringing here, and you can see this actually when you're focusing the camera on the high contrast edges. I noticed it when I was focusing on the test chart. Depending on whether I was too near or too far, you'd get a touch of purple or green fringing, and I was actually used that when the chromatic aberration was at its least. I was using that as to know when the point of focus was the most precise. Now, I did also notice that there is a touch of purple fringing just occasionally on high contrast edges, but it is, you know, very, very slight, maybe a pixel or two across, and probably not going to be noticeable the way most of us display our images on screen these days. Now, again, given the price of the lens and the cost and the fact, you know, there might be a stigma towards some Chinese lens manufacturers and lenses brought on Amazon, I have to say again, I was impressed with the lack of chromatic aberration overall. Yes, it's there if you really go pixel peeping and look for it, but generally it's not too much of an issue at all. Now, of course, it's a 1.4 lens. You're all going to want to know about what it's like to shoot 1.4, and I have to say the out of focus areas look absolutely lovely. The bokeh balls that get created in specular highlights are nice and round and circular when you're shooting at 1.4, obviously because the light's going straight through the lens barrel without the aperture blades getting in the way. As soon as you start to get down to sort of f2 where the aperture blades are coming into effect, you still get nice circular bokeh and background blur, and it all nicely blends. Given the price of the lens, it exceeds what I would expect. Those 11 aperture blades are working really, really nicely. So my overall conclusions of the Kamlan 28mm f1.4 lens: I think it's a well-made lens. We've got a solid metal construction, the focus ring and aperture are smooth, and they both handle very well. Image quality between 5.6 and f8 is good, certainly exceeding my expectations of a lens that costs under £200 from China. It's only at the very corners where there is a significant drop in quality. However, the majority of people buying this lens are going to be using it at 1.4, and here the performance is acceptable. It's sharp enough in the center, soft in the corners, but for portraits and close-ups and things like that, it shouldn't be an issue. Now, if you stop it down, it obviously helps sharpen things up, and the circular aperture blades keep the background bokeh looking nice and smooth. But the key bit is under £200, $200 as well. Although through Kickstarter, you could get it for as little as $119. Now that's an amazing price for a new manual focus lens. There really aren't a lot of other options for a 28mm f1.4 lens. There's the Nikkor 28 1.4D lens, the autofocus lens, but that still costs around £1,000 used. The Zeiss Otus 28mm f1.4, well, that's going to require you to sell a kidney, and the Leica Summilux 28mm 1.4 is going to require both kidneys to go. Now, obviously they're full frame lenses, so they perform even better on an aps-c sensor where only the center of the frame is going to be used. But let's face it, if you're looking at this lens, you're not going to be looking at those others because you're going to be working on a budget, right? So the one lens that leaves us with is the Sigma 30mm f1.4 DC-DN lens, which is also available for Sony E and Micro Four Thirds cameras. Now, you can get that new for around £250 and used for about £150. Now, that puts it in the same range as the Kamlan lens, but it also gives you autofocus. And believe me, when you're shooting at f1.4, autofocus is a real blessing. So should you get the Kamlan lens? If you want a 28mm 1.4 and you're prepared to manually focus, then really there aren't any other options. Now, if you're shooting at 1.4 and you need to focus quickly, then the Sigma 30mm AF version is probably going to be a better bet. You have to be super accurate at 1.4 with this lens, but overall I still think the lens is great value for money, well constructed, well made, and it's just in the very corners where the image quality lets it down. So that's it, that's my review of this, the Kamlan 28mm f1.4 lens. If you like this video, then hit the subscribe button. We're doing review videos and first look videos and the occasional technique video around about once a week. So hit the subscribe button so that you can keep up to date with all the latest photo gear news and reviews.